Sometimes the greatest acts of love come from those who have the least to give. Sometimes a broken man becomes whole again only when he finds someone who needs him more than he needs healing. Thomas Murphy lived under a bridge in downtown Portland. He'd been homeless for 3 years after losing his job and his apartment. Most people walked past him like he was invisible. At 52, Thomas had given up on having a real life again. One cold October night, everything changed. 2 small children appeared in the shadows near his cardboard shelter. The older girl was maybe 8 years old, holding her little brother's hand. Their clothes were dirty and torn. Both had been crying. "Mister," the girl whispered, her voice shaking with fear, "our mama just died. We don't have anywhere to go. Can we please stay with you?" Thomas looked at these 2 scared children and felt something wake up inside him that had been sleeping for years. But could a man who couldn't even take care of himself possibly save 2 children who had lost everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Murphy stared at the 2 children standing before him, their small bodies trembling in the pale light that filtered down from the street above. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, her dark hair matted and tangled, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed far too old for her young face. The boy beside her was smaller, maybe 5, clutching a worn teddy bear against his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. "What are your names?" Thomas asked gently, his voice rough from years of disuse in meaningful conversation. "I'm Emma," the girl whispered. "This is my brother Lucas. He doesn't talk much anymore." Thomas looked at Lucas, who was staring at the ground, his small fingers working nervously at the bear's matted fur. The child's silence spoke volumes about what he had witnessed, what he had endured. "How did you find me?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "We saw you here before," Emma said, "when Mama would bring us to the park during the day. She said you look like someone who used to be important." She paused, studying his weathered face. "Are you important?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Important. He hadn't felt important in 3 years. Not since the construction accident that had shattered his spine and his life in equal measure. Not since the medical bills had consumed his savings. The pain medication had become his master, and the streets had become his home. The military dog tags he still wore beneath his torn flannel shirt felt heavy against his chest. A reminder of the man he used to be, Staff Sergeant Thomas Murphy, demolitions expert, leader of men, someone people had once counted on. "I used to be," he said quietly. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mama died yesterday. We found her this morning." She was cold. The matter-of-fact way she said it broke something inside Thomas. This little girl had been forced to grow up too fast, to become the adult in situations where no child should have to be responsible. "Where have you been since then?" he asked. "Hiding," Emma said. "We knew if anyone found us, they'd take us away. Mama always said they'd separate us if something happened to her. She made me promise to take care of Lucas." Thomas looked around. His makeshift home cardboard walls reinforced with plastic tarps, a sleeping bag that had seen better years, a small camp stove he'd found in a dumpster. It wasn't much, but it had kept him alive through 3 Portland winters. Could it keep 3 people alive? "Are you hungry?" he asked. Both children nodded eagerly. Thomas reached into his backpack and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich he'd been saving for breakfast. He tore it into 3 pieces, giving the larger portions to Emma and Lucas. "This is all I have right now," he said. "But tomorrow, I'll find more." As the children ate, Thomas studied them more carefully. Emma had her mother's features, high cheekbones, and dark eyes that held depths of experience no child should possess. Lucas was fairer, with sandy hair and freckles across his nose. Both were thin, too thin, and their clothes were worn through in places. "Tell me about your mother," Thomas said. Emma's face softened slightly. "Her name was Sarah. She used to be a nurse before she got sick. She tried really hard to take care of us, but sometimes the sickness made her sleep too much or forget things." Thomas understood. He'd seen enough addiction on the streets to recognize the euphemisms. Sarah had been fighting her own demons, and the demons had won. "She loved us," Emma continued fiercely, as if defending her mother's memory. "She always said we were the best things that ever happened to her. She just couldn't fight the sadness anymore." The way Emma spoke about her mother with such protective love reminded Thomas of his own daughter, Rebecca, who would be about Emma's age now if she were still alive. The thought sent a familiar ache through his chest. Rebecca had died in the same car accident that had taken his wife 8 years ago. That loss had started his slow slide toward the streets, though it had taken years and a series of increasingly poor decisions to land him here. "She sounds like she was a good mother," Thomas said. "The best," Emma whispered, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. Lucas, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "Are you going to leave us too?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. The question cut straight to Thomas's heart. Here was a child who had already been abandoned by death, by circumstance, by a system that would rather separate siblings than keep families together. Lucas was asking the one question that mattered most. Could he trust this stranger not to disappear like everyone else in his short life? Thomas looked at both children, seeing himself reflected in their eyes, lost, afraid, desperately in need of someone to believe in them. For 3 years, he had been focused solely on his own survival, on getting through each day without dying. But looking at Emma and Lucas, he realized that mere survival wasn't enough anymore. These children needed more than just someone to share their cardboard shelter. They needed someone to believe in their future, to fight for their right to stay together, to show them that family wasn't just about blood relations. "No," Thomas said firmly, "I'm not going to leave you. We're going to figure this out together." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief, and Lucas moved closer to Thomas, still clutching his teddy bear. "What happens now?" Emma asked. Thomas looked out at the city lights reflecting on the river below. Somewhere out there was a world that had written him off, a system that would try to separate these children, authorities who would see his homelessness as evidence of his inability to care for anyone. But somewhere out there was also hope, people who still believed in second chances, in the power of love to overcome circumstances, in the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. "Now," Thomas said, spreading his sleeping bag wider so all 3 of them could share its warmth, "we become a family." As the children settled beside him, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time since his world had collapsed, he had a reason to wake up tomorrow that went beyond mere survival. He had people depending on him, people who needed him to be better than he had been, stronger than he felt. The dog tags against his chest seemed to warm slightly, reminding him of the man he had once been, the man who had led soldiers through impossible situations, who had never left anyone behind, who had understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for glory or recognition, but for the simple right to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new reasons for the world to try to tear apart what they were building. But tonight, under a bridge in Portland, 3 lost souls had found each other, and that was enough to start rebuilding from. Thomas woke to the sound of Emma whimpering in her sleep. The morning light filtering through the gaps in his cardboard walls cast long shadows across their makeshift shelter. Lucas was curled against his side, the teddy bear pressed against his face, his breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since Thomas had met him. The reality of their situation, hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. 3 people sharing. A space meant for one. 3 mouths to feed when he could barely manage to feed himself. 3 lives depending on his ability to navigate a world that had already discarded him once. Emma stirred, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw Thomas watching her, she sat up quickly, as if embarrassed to have been caught in a moment of vulnerability. "Did I wake you?" she asked. "No," Thomas lied gently. "I'm usually up early. Are you hungry?" Both children nodded, and Thomas felt the familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach. His usual routine involved checking dumpsters behind restaurants, hoping to find day-old bread or produce that was still edible. It was a degrading process that he had learned to endure for his own survival, but the thought of making these children wait while he scavenged through garbage filled him with shame. "I need to go find us some breakfast," he said. "I want you both to stay here. Stay quiet, and don't let anyone see you." "Can you do that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "How long will you be gone?" "Not long," Thomas promised, though he had no idea how long it might take to find enough food for 3 people. He pulled on his worn jacket and grabbed his backpack, pausing at the entrance to their shelter. Emma had wrapped her arms around Lucas, and they were both watching him with the same expression of barely contained fear, the look of children who had learned not to trust that adults would return when they said they would. "I'm coming back," Thomas said firmly. "I promise." The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Thomas could see his breath as he made his way through the maze of support pillars beneath the bridge. The other residents of their makeshift community were beginning to stir old Pete with his shopping cart full of aluminum cans. Maria, who talked to herself in rapid Spanish. Jimmy, who claimed to be a Vietnam veteran, though he was clearly too young to have served. Thomas had always kept to himself, maintaining the minimal social contact necessary for survival while avoiding the complications that came with getting too involved in other people's problems. But now, walking away from Emma and Lucas, he found himself cataloging potential allies, people who might be willing to help if the situation became desperate. The nearest restaurant district was a 15-minute walk, and Thomas made his way through the early morning streets with practiced invisibility. He had learned to move through the city like a ghost, avoiding eye contact with commuters, staying clear of the business entrances where security guards might chase him away. Behind Tony's Italian kitchen, he found a bag of day-old bread rolls and several containers of soup that were still good. Behind the coffee shop next door, he discovered pastries that were perfectly edible despite being a day past their sell-by date. It was more food than he usually found in a single morning, and Thomas allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe he could take care of them. He was making his way back toward the bridge when he saw the white sedan parked near the entrance to their area. The government license plate made his blood run cold, and he quickened his pace, keeping to the fil de rire shadows as he approached. Through the gaps in the concrete barriers, he could see a woman in a business suit talking to Emma. The woman had a clipboard and an official-looking badge hanging from her neck. Child Protective Services. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he crept closer, straining to hear their conversation. "My name is Sarah Chun," the woman was saying. "I'm here to help you." Someone called in a report about 2 children living under this bridge. "We're fine," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear Thomas could see in her posture. "We're waiting for our uncle. What's your uncle's name?" Sarah Chun asked gently, making notes on her clipboard. Emma hesitated, and Thomas could see her mind racing. "Thomas," she said finally. "Thomas Murphy." "And where is Thomas now?" "He went to get us breakfast. He'll be back soon." Sarah Chun looked around at the cardboard shelter, at Lucas, who was clutching his teddy bear and staring at the ground with wide, frightened eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "this isn't a safe place for children to live. I have a nice warm place where you and your brother can stay while we figure out what's best for you." "No," Emma said quickly. We want to stay together. We want to wait for Thomas. I understand that you want to stay together, Sarah Chun said. But right now, I need to make sure you're both safe and taken care of. We can talk about your uncle when he gets back. Thomas watched as Sarah Chun reached for her radio, probably calling for backup or transportation. He had maybe minutes before more officials arrived, before Emma and Lucas were taken away and disappeared into a system that would split them up and place them in separate foster homes. He thought about his military training, about the tactical situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Every instinct told him to run, to disappear back into the city and let someone else deal with the complications these children represented. But then he looked at Lucas, saw the way the little boy's shoulders were shaking, and Thomas felt something harden inside him. He thought about his own daughter, about the promise he had made to Rebecca in the hospital before she died, that he would always protect the innocent, always fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Thomas stood up and walked out of the shadows. I'm Thomas Murphy, he said, his voice carrying the authority he had once used to command soldiers. These are my children. Sarah Chun looked up, startled. She took in Thomas's appearance, the worn clothes, the stubble, the obvious signs of homelessness, and her expression shifted from surprise to professional concern. Mr. Murphy, she said carefully, I'm Sarah Chun with Child Protective Services. We received a report about 2 children living in unsafe conditions. They're safe with me, Thomas said. Sir, I can see that you care about these children, but living under a bridge is not an appropriate environment for minors. I need to take them to a temporary placement while we sort this situation out. You're not taking them anywhere, Thomas said, stepping protectively in front of Emma and Lucas. Mr. Murphy, I understand this is difficult, but I have a legal obligation to ensure these children's welfare. If you're truly their guardian, we can discuss custody arrangements through the proper channels. We don't need channels, Thomas said. We need to be left alone. Sarah Chun's voice remained calm and professional, but Thomas could see her hand moving toward her radio again. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. I'm placing these children in emergency protective custody. Mel, Emma said, jumping up and grabbing Thomas's hand. Please don't take us away from him. He's taking care of us. Lucas, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, suddenly ran to Thomas and wrapped his arms around Thomas's legs, burying his face against Thomas's worn jeans. Please, the little boy whispered, his voice muffled but audible. Don't let them take us. The weight of Lucas's trust, the desperation in Emma's voice, the knowledge that these children saw him as their protector despite his obvious limitations, it all crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity for Thomas. He had been adrift for 3 years, surviving without purpose, existing without hope. But these children had given him something worth fighting for, something worth being better for. They didn't see a homeless man who had lost everything. They saw someone who had chosen them, someone who had promised not to leave. You're not taking them, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. They stay with me. Sarah Chun looked at the 3 of them, the homeless veteran, the 8-year-old girl trying to be brave, the 5-year-old boy who had finally found someone he trusted enough to speak to. And Thomas could see her wrestling with her training and her humanity. Mr. Murphy, she said finally, I can give you 24 hours to figure out a better living situation. But if I come back tomorrow and find these children still living under this bridge, I will have no choice but to remove them for their own safety. She handed him a business card. My number is on there. Call me when you have a plan. After she left, Thomas knelt down between Emma and Lucas, looking into their faces. They were still frightened, still uncertain, but there was something else there now, hope. They believed he would find a way to keep them together, to keep them safe. What are we going to do? Emma asked. Thomas looked at the business card in his hand, then at the cardboard shelter that had been his home for 3 years. For the first time since he had lost everything, he began to think about the future, not in terms of mere survival, but in terms of building something better. We're going to prove, he said, that family isn't about having a fancy house or a lot of money. We're going to prove that love is enough. 24 hours. Thomas stared at Sarah Chun's business card as the children shared the food he had brought back. 24 hours to find a miracle, to transform their lives in a way that would satisfy a system designed to separate families like theirs. Thomas? Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. Are we really going to be okay? He looked at her serious face, at Lucas, who was methodically tearing his bread roll into tiny pieces before eating each one. The boy's teddy bear sat beside him, on the cardboard floor, its button eyes seeming to watch Thomas with the same expectant trust as its owner. We're going to try, Thomas said honestly. But it might mean we have to leave this place. Where would we go? Emma asked. Thomas didn't have an answer, but he knew they couldn't stay under the bridge. Not if they wanted to stay together. He thought about the other homeless families he'd encountered over the years, the ones who had managed to find more stable situations. Most had moved into their cars, if they had them, or found abandoned buildings where they could set up more permanent shelters. Let me ask around, he said. There might be places we can go. After the children finished eating, Thomas left them with strict instructions to stay hidden and made his way through the encampment beneath the bridge. He found old Pete sorting through his collection of aluminum cans, muttering to himself about rising metal prices. Pete, Thomas said, settling down beside the older man. You know about families living rough. Any suggestions for someone with kids? Pete looked up, his weathered face creasing with surprise. Kids? You got kids now, Murphy. 2 of them, boy and a girl. I need somewhere better than cardboard and tarps. Pete scratched his grizzled beard thoughtfully. There's an old warehouse, about 6 blocks north. Condemned, but the roof doesn't leak much. Saw a family with 3 kids there last month before they moved on to Seattle. What about services? Schools? Schools are tricky without an address, Pete said. But there's a church over on Burnside that don't ask too many questions. Father Martinez, he's good people. Might be able to help with documentation, that sort of thing. Thomas filed away the information, then spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies. Using money he'd saved from selling recyclables, he bought a small camping lantern, extra blankets, and more food than he'd purchased in months. Every dollar spent was a dollar he couldn't save for rent or a security deposit. But looking at Emma and Lucas's faces when he returned with the supplies made the sacrifice worthwhile. We're going to move tonight, he told them. Somewhere with more space, more privacy. Will it be safe? Emma asked. Safer than here, Thomas said. And we'll be together. As the sun set, they packed their few possessions into Thomas's backpack and a garbage bag Emma had found. Lucas refused to be separated from his teddy bear, clutching it against his chest as they prepared to leave the only shelter they'd known together, the warehouse. Pete had mentioned was a hulking brick building with boards covering most of its windows. Thomas found an entrance through a loading dock that had been pried open by previous occupants. Inside, the space was vast and echoing, with concrete floors and exposed beams reaching up in the darkness. It's like a castle, Lucas whispered, speaking for only the second time since Thomas had known him. Emma looked around with more practical eyes. Where will we sleep? Thomas led them to a corner where someone had built a small room using sheets of plywood and plastic tarps. The previous occupants had left behind some furniture, a mattress that was stained but not moldy, a small table made from a wooden crate, even a battery-powered radio that still worked. We can make this work, Thomas said, setting down their supplies as they arranged their new home. Thomas watched the children, adapt with the resilience that amazed him. Emma immediately began organizing their possessions, creating designated spaces for clothes, food, and Lucas's teddy bear. Lucas explored every corner of their small area, trailing his fingers along the walls as if memorizing the boundaries of their new safety. "Tell us about when you were a soldier," Emma said as they settled down for the night. Thomas was surprised by the request. He rarely talked about his military service, partly because it reminded him of the man he used to be, the man he'd failed to remain. "How did you know I was a soldier?" Emma pointed to the chain around his neck, barely visible beneath his shirt. "Those are dog tags. Mama dated a soldier once. He had them too." Thomas touched the tags, feeling their familiar weight. "I was in the army for 12 years. I helped build things and sometimes, when necessary, I helped take things apart. Did you fight bad guys?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes," Thomas said carefully. "But mostly I tried to protect good people, like other soldiers, who were far from home and scared. Like us?" Emma asked. The comparison hit Thomas unexpectedly. In many ways, he realized that was exactly what they were, soldiers far from any home they'd ever known, depending on each other for survival in hostile territory. "Yes, like us." Over the following days, they established routines that began to feel like a family life. Thomas would wake early to scavenge for food and supplies, always returning before the children woke up. Emma took charge of organizing their space and rationing their food to make it last. Lucas, still mostly silent, became their scout, alerting them to any sounds or movements that might indicate visitors to the warehouse. Thomas began teaching them practical skills: how to purify water using a small camping filter he'd found, how to stay warm using layers and shared body heat, how to move quietly through the building without attracting attention. But Emma, with her sharp mind and fierce protectiveness of her brother, began teaching Thomas as well. "Lucas likes it when you read to him," she said one evening after the boy had fallen asleep. "He hasn't talked much since Mama got really sick, but he listens to everything you say." Thomas looked at the sleeping child, noting how Lucas's breathing had become steadier and deeper since they'd moved to the warehouse. The constant fear that had marked his first nights under the bridge was gradually giving way to something that looked almost like peace. "What about you?" Thomas asked Emma. "What do you need?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "I need to know we're not going to have to run again. I need to know that when I wake up tomorrow, you'll still be here." The weight of her trust was almost overwhelming. This 8-year-old girl had already lost so much, had been forced to be strong for her brother in ways no child should have to be. Now she was asking Thomas to be the stable presence she'd never had, the adult who wouldn't disappear when things got difficult. "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas said. "We're a family now, and families stick together." Emma nodded, but Thomas could see the lingering doubt in her eyes. She'd heard promises before from adults who had ultimately failed her. He understood that trust would have to be earned, day by day, through consistency and presence rather than words. That night, as Thomas lay awake listening to the children's quiet breathing, he thought about the man he'd been before, the soldier who had never left anyone behind, the construction foreman who had taken pride in building things that would last, the father who had read bedtime stories and bandaged scraped knees. Somewhere in the wreckage of his old life, that man still existed. These children needed him to find his way back to that person, to remember that being strong wasn't about having no vulnerabilities, but about protecting the people who mattered most. Outside the warehouse, the city continued its restless movement, full of people who had homes to return to, families waiting for them, futures they could plan and expect. Inside their small corner of the abandoned building, 3 people who had lost everything were beginning to discover that sometimes losing everything was the first step toward finding what really mattered. 3 weeks into their life, At the warehouse, Thomas discovered that Emma had been keeping a notebook. He found it tucked beneath her pillow when he was straightening their makeshift bedding, a composition book with a marbled black and white cover, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. "Emma," he said gently when she returned from using the bathroom facilities they'd rigged up in another part of the building. "I found this. I wasn't trying to look at your private things." Emma's face flushed red, and she quickly took the notebook from his hands. "It's nothing important." But Thomas had glimpsed enough to know it wasn't nothing. The pages had been filled with what looked like letters, each one beginning with, "Dear Mama." "You don't have to show me," Thomas said. "But if you want to talk about it, I'm here." Emma clutched the notebook against her chest, looking torn between secrecy and the obvious need to share her burden with someone. "I write to her," she said finally. "To Mama. I tell her about what we're doing, about how Lucas is getting better, about how you take care of us." She paused, looking down at the notebook. "Is that weird?" "Not weird at all," Thomas said, remembering the letters he'd written to his own daughter in the months after the accident. Pages and pages of words he'd never been able to say while she was alive. "Sometimes we need to keep talking to the people we love, even after they're gone." Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I told her about you in yesterday's letter. I said you're teaching us how to be strong." "What else did you tell her?" "That we found a family again, even though it doesn't look like the families in picture books." Emma opened the notebook to a page near the middle. "Would you like to hear what I wrote?" Thomas nodded, settling down beside her on their shared mattress. Lucas looked up from where he was arranging his teddy bear's limbs in different positions, clearly listening even though he pretended to be focused on his play. Emma cleared her throat and began to read. "Dear Mama, today Thomas taught me how to use the camp stove without burning myself. He says cooking is an important skill, and that when I get older, I can make meals for our whole family. He doesn't have much money, but he always makes sure Lucas and I eat first. Yesterday, he used his whole sandwich because he said he wasn't hungry, but I could tell he was lying because his stomach was making noise." She looked up at Thomas. "You do that a lot. Pretend you're not hungry so we can have more food." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I eat plenty. You eat what's left," Emma corrected. "Mama used to do that too, especially when she was getting sicker. She'd say she'd already eaten, but I knew she was saving everything for us." The comparison to her mother wasn't one Thomas had expected, but he could see the truth in it. Both he and Sarah had been adults trying to protect children in impossible circumstances, sacrificing their own needs to ensure the children survived. "Your mother sounds like she was a good person who loved you very much," Thomas said. "She was," Emma said fiercely. "The sickness made her do things she wouldn't normally do, but she never stopped loving us. Even at the end when she could barely stay awake, she would still try to braid my hair and sing to Lucas." Lucas looked up at the mention of singing, and Thomas saw something flicker across the boy's face, a memory, perhaps, of better times when his mother's voice had meant comfort instead of farewell. "What kind of songs?" Thomas asked. "Silly ones, mostly," Emma said, smiling for the first time in days. "There was one about a frog who wanted to be a prince, and another about a little bird who was afraid to fly." "I remember the bird song," Lucas said suddenly, his voice so quiet Thomas almost missed it. Emma's eyes widened. Lucas had been speaking more in recent days, but never about their mother. Never about the time before. "Do you remember how it went?" Emma asked gently. Lucas nodded and began to hum a simple melody, his voice wavering but clear. After a few bars, Emma joined in, and Thomas listened as they sang together. Little bird, sitting in your tree, the whole wide world is waiting there for you to see. Don't be scared, don't be shy, spread your wings and try. Little bird, you were meant to fly." When they finished, Lucas was crying. Not the silent tears of grief Thomas had seen before, but the kind of tears that came with the release of long-held emotion. "Mama said I was her little bird," Lucas whispered. "She said someday I would fly far away and see wonderful things, but I would always remember the nest where I learned to be brave." Thomas felt his own eyes burn with tears. She was right. "You are brave, Lucas. You've been brave every day since I've known you." That evening, Thomas made a decision that had been building in his mind for days. The warehouse provided shelter, but it wasn't enough for these children. Emma needed to be in school, learning and growing with children her own age. Lucas needed stability, routine, the kind of security that would help him continue to heal from his trauma. "We need to talk about school," Thomas said as they shared a dinner of canned soup and crackers. Emma's face brightened immediately. "Real school? With books and teachers?" "Real school," Thomas confirmed, "but it's going to be complicated. Schools need addresses, emergency contacts, proof of guardianship." "Do we have those things?" Emma asked. "Not yet," Thomas admitted. "But I know someone who might be able to help us figure it out." The next morning, Thomas left the children with careful instructions about staying hidden while he made his way to the church old Pete had mentioned. St. Francis Catholic Church was a modest building squeezed between a laundromat and a convenience store. Its red brick facade weathered but well-maintained. Father Martinez was a small man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of physical work beyond his pastoral duties. When Thomas explained his situation, carefully omitting some of the more complex details about how he'd come to be caring for Emma and Lucas, the priest listened without judgment. "These children," Father Martinez said when Thomas finished, "they are not legally yours. They're mine in every way that matters," Thomas said. "But no, not legally. And their mother? Dead. No other family that we know of." Father Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face. "You understand what you're asking of me? To help you circumvent systems that exist to protect children." "I understand that those systems would separate them," Thomas said. "Emma and Lucas have already lost their mother. They don't need to lose each other too. And what can you offer them? A homeless man living in an abandoned warehouse?" The question stung because it was fair. What could he offer them that a stable foster family couldn't provide better? "Love," Thomas said finally. "Consistency. The promise that they'll never be abandoned again. I know it's not much compared to what other people could give them, but it's what they need most right now." Father Martinez nodded slowly. "Love is never not much, my friend. Love is everything." He paused, then continued. "I cannot help you deceive authorities or break laws, but I can help you navigate systems, find resources, perhaps create pathways to make your family legal in the eyes of the law." "What would that take?" "Time, patience, proof that you can provide a stable home environment." Father Martinez pulled out a worn address book. "I know people who work in family services, people who believe that keeping families together should be the priority. I also know about transitional housing programs, job training resources, ways to help people rebuild their lives." Thomas felt a spark of hope he hadn't experienced in years. "You would help us?" "I would help you help yourself," Father Martinez corrected. "The children can attend our parish school while you work on getting your life stabilized. We have a uniform program for families in need. And we don't ask questions about addresses as long as the children are clean, fed, and ready to learn." When Thomas returned to the warehouse that afternoon, he found Emma teaching Lucas to read using pages torn from an old magazine she'd found. The sight of the two children bent over the makeshift lesson, Emma's patient voice guiding her brother through simple words, filled Thomas with a fierce determination to make Father Martinez's plan work. "I have good news," he announced, settling down beside them. "You're going to start school next week." Emma's face lit up with the first genuine joy Thomas had seen from her. "Really? Real school with real teachers? Real school, Thomas confirmed. And Lucas, you'll be in kindergarten. You'll learn to read even better than Emma's teaching you. Lucas looked up from the magazine, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. Will you come with us? I'll walk you there every morning and pick you up every afternoon, Thomas promised. You'll never have to wonder if I'm coming back. That night, as the children slept, Thomas lay awake planning their future with a focus and clarity he hadn't felt since his military days. He made mental lists of what they would need: school supplies, appropriate clothes, a more permanent address, legitimate income. Each item on the list represented a challenge, but for the first time in 3 years, Thomas was thinking in terms of solutions rather than mere survival. Emma's notebook lay beside her pillow, and Thomas found himself wondering what she would write to her mother tomorrow. Perhaps she would tell Sarah about the school, about the priest who had offered to help them, about the slowly growing certainty that they might actually make it as a family. Outside the warehouse, the city hummed with the sounds of late-night traffic and distant music. Inside their small sanctuary, 3 people who had found each other in their darkest moments were beginning to believe that the morning might bring something better than just another day of surviving. They were beginning to believe in the possibility of truly living again. The first day of school arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made the air smell like possibilities. Thomas had spent his last $20 on a small backpack for Lucas and school supplies for both children. Emma wore a donated uniform from the church, a navy blue jumper that was slightly too big but clean and pressed, while Lucas had been fitted with pants and a polo shirt that made him look impossibly young and vulnerable. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they walked the 6 blocks to St. Francis School. "A little," Emma admitted, adjusting the straps of her backpack. What if? The other kids asked where we live. Thomas had coached them on this. "You tell them you live with your Uncle Thomas near the River District. That's not a lie." Lucas walked between them, his hand firmly gripped in Thomas's, his teddy bear tucked securely in his new backpack. The boy had barely spoken that morning, but Thomas could feel the tension in his small body. "What if they don't like me?" Lucas whispered. Thomas stopped walking and knelt down to Lucas's level, looking directly into the boy's worried eyes. "You know what I learned in the army? Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just show up. You're showing up today, and that makes you brave." Lucas nodded solemnly, seeming to draw strength from Thomas's words. The school was a modest building, attached to the church, with a playground that showed signs of recent maintenance and classrooms visible through clean windows. Other children were arriving with their parents, and Thomas felt a familiar stab of insecurity as he compared himself to the well-dressed adults dropping off their kid's father. Martinez was waiting for them at the entrance, wearing a warm smile and a casual sweater that made him seem more like a favorite uncle than a priest. "Emma, Lucas," he said, crouching down to their level. "Are you ready for your first day?" Emma nodded eagerly, but Lucas stepped closer to Thomas, suddenly shy. "Mrs. Patterson is going to be your teacher, Lucas," Father Martinez continued gently. "She taught my nephew when he was your age, and she's very good at helping children feel comfortable." A middle-aged woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes approached them. "You must be Lucas," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. Would you like to see our classroom?" Lucas looked up at Thomas, seeking permission. "Go ahead," Thomas said. "I'll be right here when school ends." As Mrs. Patterson led Lucas away, Thomas watched the boy's small figure disappear into the building and felt a powerful surge of pride mixed with anxiety. This was what normal children did. They went to school, learned things, made friends. But Lucas wasn't a normal child, and Thomas couldn't shake the worry that the other kids would somehow sense his difference. His loss, his complicated history. Emma's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was younger and energetic, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she genuinely loved her job. "Emma, I understand you've been homeschooled for a while," she said, leading them toward a bright classroom filled with books and artwork. "We'll do a quick assessment to see where you are academically, but don't worry, we'll make sure you're in the right place." Thomas started to follow them into the classroom, but Emma turned back to him. "I'll be okay," she said, and Thomas could see her drawing on the same strength that had helped her survive her mother's death and the uncertainty of the streets. "Thank you for making this happen." The simple gratitude in her voice nearly undid him. Walking away from the school, leaving the children in the care of strangers, even for a few hours, felt like the hardest thing he'd done since taking them in. But it also felt like the most important step they'd taken toward building a real life together. With the children safely in school, Thomas had 6 hours to focus on the next item on his mental list: finding legitimate work. Father Martinez had given him the name of a construction foreman who was known to hire day laborers without asking too many questions about addresses or documentation gaps. The job site was a renovation project on an old office building downtown. Thomas found the foreman, a weathered man named Martinez, who claimed no relation to the priest despite sharing the name. "You done construction before?" Martinez asked, looking Thomas up and down. 12 years, Thomas said. "Mostly commercial. I can frame, do electrical rough-in, finish work." "What happened? Why are you looking for day work instead of steady employment?" Thomas had prepared for this question. "Had some personal problems for a while. Getting my life back together now." Martinez studied him for a moment longer. "I'll give you a try. $7.50 an hour. Cash at the end of each day. You show up on time, work hard, don't cause problems. Maybe we can talk about something more regular." Thomas spent the day doing the kind of physical labor he hadn't performed in years, his muscles protesting as he carried materials and operated tools that felt both familiar and foreign in his hands. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, about building something instead of just surviving from day to day. At 2:30, he left the job site and hurried back to the school, arriving just as the children were being dismissed. Lucas spotted him first and ran across the playground, launching himself into Thomas's arms with an enthusiasm that drew smiles from the other parents. "How was it?" Thomas asked, setting the boy down. "Good," Lucas said, his voice stronger than Thomas had heard it in weeks. "Mrs. Patterson has a pet hamster named Charlie, and I gotta feed him." Emma appeared more composed, but equally pleased. "Ms. Rodriguez says I'm reading at a 7th grade level," she reported. "She's going to give me some extra books to challenge me." As they walked home, both children chattered about their teachers, their classmates, the routine of scheduled lessons, and recess. Thomas listened, marveling at how quickly they had adapted to this new environment, how hungry they had been for the structure and normalcy that school provided. "Did anyone ask about where we live?" he asked. "A couple kids asked," Emma said. "I told them what you said, that we live with our uncle near the river." Nobody seemed to think it was weird. That evening, as the children did homework at their makeshift table, and Thomas counted the day's earnings, $60, more money than he'd had at one time in months, he began to feel something he barely recognized: optimism. They were building something real, something that might actually last. Anna was thriving academically. Lucas was beginning to come out of his shell. And Thomas was remembering what it felt like to be useful, to have skills that people valued. But even as he allowed himself to hope, Thomas was aware of the fragility of their situation. They were still living in an abandoned building, still technically homeless, still vulnerable to discovery by authorities who might not understand that unconventional didn't necessarily mean unsuitable. Sarah Chun's business card was still tucked in his wallet, a reminder that their 24-hour reprieve had stretched into weeks, through luck and careful avoidance rather than any official resolution. Sooner or later, They would need to emerge from the shadows and prove to the world that their makeshift family deserved recognition and protection. For now, though, watching Emma help Lucas with his alphabet practice while dinner heated on their small camp stove, Thomas allowed himself to believe that they were moving in the right direction. Step by step, day by day, they were transforming from three lost individuals into something stronger. A family bound not by blood or law, but by choice and commitment, and a fierce determination to protect what they had built together. 6 weeks into their new routine, Thomas was carrying a lunch pail again. The simple act of packing a sandwich and thermos of coffee each morning brought back memories of the man he'd been before. Purposeful, productive, someone who contributed to the world rather than just surviving in its margins. Martinez had made good on his promise of steadier work, and Thomas was now earning regular wages as part of the renovation crew. His hands had remembered their old skills, and the other workers had accepted him with the easy camaraderie of men who understood that everyone had a story. And most stories included chapters people preferred not to share. The children had settled into school with an ease that amazed their teachers. Emma had tested into advanced reading and math groups, while Lucas had begun speaking more frequently in class, even volunteering to read aloud during story time. Mrs. Patterson had pulled Thomas aside after the first parent-teacher conference to tell him that Lucas's progress was remarkable for a child who had experienced trauma. "Whatever you're doing at home," she had said, "keep doing it. That little boy feels safe and loved, and that's the foundation everything else builds on." But it was Emma who surprised Thomas the most. As her confidence in their stability grew, she began to reveal depths of intelligence and curiosity that had been hidden beneath the survival instincts forced on her by circumstances. She devoured every book the school library had to offer and had begun writing stories of her own tales of children who found families in unexpected places, of people who discovered that home wasn't a place but a feeling. "I want to be a writer when I grow up," she announced one evening as they shared dinner in their warehouse corner. "Like the people who wrote all those books at school." "You already are a writer," Thomas said, gesturing toward her notebook, which had grown from letters to her mother into a collection of stories, poems, and observations about their daily life. "What kind of stories do you want to tell?" Emma considered this seriously. "Stories about people who think they're broken but find out they're just different. Stories about families that don't look like the ones in picture books but love each other just as much." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest, recognizing himself and Lucas in her description. Those sound like important stories to tell. They are," Emma said with the certainty of someone who had lived those stories, because there are lots of people who need to hear them. It was during this period of growing stability that Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Walking past an apartment complex on his way home from work, he noticed a "for rent" sign in the ground floor window. The building was older, the neighborhood wasn't the best, but it was clean and safe, with a small playground where Lucas could play, and good lighting in the parking areas. Thomas stood outside that building for 20 minutes, calculating numbers in his head. With his steady income and the money he'd been saving, he could probably afford the security deposit and first month's rent. It would mean giving up the last of his financial safety net, committing to monthly payments that would stretch his budget to its limits, but it would also mean giving the children a real home with heat, running water, and an address that wouldn't raise questions. That evening, he broached the subject carefully. "How would you feel about moving into an apartment?" he asked. Emma's eyes widened. "A real apartment? With our own bathroom and kitchen?" "It would be small," Thomas warned. "Probably just 2 bedrooms, and it would mean we'd have to be very careful with money." "I don't care if it's small," Emma said quickly. "And I'm good at being careful with money. I've been keeping track of our expenses in my notebook." Lucas, who had been listening quietly, looked up from his homework. "Would we have our own beds?" The question hit Thomas hard. The children had been sharing the single mattress for weeks without complaint, never mentioning that they might want their own space, their own privacy. Yes, Thomas said. You would each have your own bed, your own space, and we'd all live there, together? Lucas asked, seeking confirmation of the thing that mattered most to him, that their family would remain intact. All together, Thomas promised. The next day, Thomas called the number on the rental sign during his lunch break. The landlord, a woman named Mrs. Chumno, relation to the social worker, she assured him, agreed to meet him that evening to show the apartment. It was small, as Thomas had warned, but it was clean and bright, with hardwood floors that showed signs of recent refinishing and windows that let in plenty of light. The kitchen was tiny but functional, the bathroom had a real shower, and there were indeed 2 bedrooms, each just large enough for a bed and a dresser. References? Mrs. Chun asked, consulting her clipboard. Thomas had prepared for this. I can have my current employer write something up. And Father Martinez at St. Francis Church has known our family for a couple of months. Mrs. Chun nodded, making notes. Employment verification, first month's rent, security deposit, and we can probably have you moved in by the weekend. Walking home to tell the children, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. They were going to have a real home, a place where Emma could do homework at a proper table, and Lucas could display his school artwork on the refrigerator. A place where Thomas could cook real meals instead of heating canned soup on a camp stove. But even as he imagined their new life, Thomas was aware of the risks he was taking. Moving into an apartment meant establishing an official presence in the system, creating a paper trail that could be followed by people like Sarah Chun. If Child Protective Services decided to investigate their family situation, they would no longer be able to simply disappear into the urban landscape. He was betting everything on the hope that their obvious stability, the children's success in school, his steady employment, their clear bond as a family would outweigh the unconventional way they had come together. When he told Emma and Lucas about the apartment, their reaction exceeded even his optimistic expectations. Emma actually cried tears of joy that she tried to hide, but that Thomas pretended not to notice. Lucas asked if he could put up the drawings he'd made at school, if he could have a place for his teddy bear, if Thomas would still read to him at bedtime. Everything will be the same, Thomas assured him. Just better, more comfortable, more private. Still the 3 of us, still a family. As they began planning their move, packing their few possessions into boxes scrounged from behind stores, Thomas reflected on how far they had come. 3 months ago, he had been a man without purpose, surviving without hope. Emma and Lucas had been children without protection, facing an uncertain future in an indifferent system. Now they were a family with a home, with routines and plans, and the kind of ordinary problems that normal families faced, like whether they could afford cable television and what color curtains to hang in the living room windows. But Thomas also knew that their story was far from over. Somewhere in the city, there were systems and authorities who might not approve of their unconventional arrangement. People who might decide that love and stability weren't enough if they didn't come wrapped in the proper legal documentation. For now, though, he chose to focus on the immediate future, teaching Lucas to ride the bike they'd found at a garage sale, helping Emma with her science project, learning to be the kind of father these children deserved, not perfect, but present, committed, and determined to give them the childhood they had almost lost. Thomas was assembling Lucas's new bed frame when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the apartment door that made Emma look up from her homework, and Lucas pause in his careful arrangement of his stuffed animals on the dresser. They had been in the apartment for exactly 2 weeks, and Thomas had begun to believe they might actually be safe. The children were thriving in their new environment. Emma had claimed the larger bedroom and turned it into a study space filled with library books, while Lucas had decorated his room with his school artwork and had started sleeping through the night without nightmares. "Stay here," Thomas told the children, moving toward the door with a calm he didn't feel. Through the peephole, he saw Sarah Chun standing in the hallway, clipboard in hand, looking exactly as professional and determined as she had that first morning under the bridge. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs, but he opened the door with what he hoped was a welcoming expression. "Miss Chun," he said. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Murphy," she replied, her tone neutral. "May I come in?" Thomas stepped aside, allowing her to enter the small living room. Emma and Lucas appeared in the hallway, drawn by curiosity despite his instructions to stay in their rooms. "I see. You found more suitable housing," Sarah said, taking in the modest but clean apartment, the furniture that was mismatched but functional, the obvious signs of a family life in progress. "We have," Thomas said carefully. "The children are doing well. They're both in school, making good grades, adjusting beautifully." Sarah nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "I'm sure they are. However, Mr. Murphy, I'm here because I've received some additional information about your situation that requires investigation." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "What kind of information?" Sarah consulted her notes. "It's come to my attention that you may not actually be the children's uncle, as you originally claimed. In fact, there's reason to believe you have no legal relationship to Emma and Lucas whatsoever." Emma stepped forward, her young face fierce with protective anger. "He's taking care of us. We want to be here." "I understand that, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "But there are legal procedures that must be followed when it comes to guardianship of minor children." "What legal procedures?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Background checks, home studies, formal custody arrangements through the court system." Sarah set down her clipboard and looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Murphy, I want to be clear that I can see the children are well cared for. They're obviously healthy, happy, and thriving under your care. But that doesn't change the fact that you're essentially operating outside the law." Thomas felt the foundation of their new life beginning to crack beneath his feet. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means that unless you can produce legal documentation proving your right to custody, I'm going to have to place Emma and Lucas in emergency foster care while we sort this situation out." "No," Lucas said, his voice small but absolutely certain. He ran to Thomas and wrapped his arms around his waist. "I don't want to go anywhere else. This is my home." Sarah's professional composure softened slightly as she looked at the frightened little boy clinging to the man who had become his father in every way but name. "Lucas, I know this is scary, but there are rules about who can take care of children, and those rules exist to protect you." "He is protecting us," Emma said, moving to stand beside Thomas as well. "He's the best father we've ever had." The word father hung in the air, and Thomas realized that somewhere in the past few months, that's exactly what he had become. Not uncle, not guardian, not temporary caretaker, but father, the person these children trusted completely, the man who had rebuilt his entire life around their needs and happiness. "Miss Chun," Thomas said, "what would it take to make this legal? What would I need to do to get official custody?" Sarah reopened her clipboard and flipped through several pages. "Given that the children's mother is deceased and there are no other known relatives, you could potentially apply for guardianship through the family court system, but it's a complex process that requires extensive background checks, financial stability verification, home studies, and court appearances." "How long does that process take?" "Minimum of 6 months, often longer." Sarah looked at the children, then back at Thomas. "And during that time, the children would need to be placed in temporary foster care. Together?" Emma asked quickly. Sarah hesitated before answering. "We would try to keep you together, but I can't guarantee it. There aren't many foster homes equipped to take 2 children simultaneously, especially when one has experienced the kind of trauma Lucas has dealt with. Thomas felt something crystallize inside him, a determination that went beyond his own feelings or fears. These children had already lost their mother, had already been abandoned by every system that was supposed to protect them. They had found stability and love in an unconventional family, and he would not let bureaucracy destroy what they had built together. What if I could prove that I have a legitimate connection to their mother? Thomas asked. What if I could show that she intended for me to care for them if something happened to her? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Do you have such documentation? Thomas didn't, but an idea was forming in his mind, risky, potentially disastrous, but possibly their only chance to stay together. Give me 48 hours, he said, before you make any decisions about foster care. Give me 2 days to provide you with the documentation you need. Sarah studied his face, clearly weighing her options. Mr. Murphy, I hope you understand that I'm not trying to punish you or the children. I can see that you care deeply about them, and they obviously love you. But I have legal obligations. 48 hours, Thomas repeated. Please. After a long moment, Sarah nodded. 48 hours. But Mr. Murphy, if you can't produce legitimate documentation proving your legal right to these children, I will have to proceed with emergency placement. After she left, Thomas sat down heavily on the couch, his mind racing. Emma and Lucas flanked him, their bodies pressed against his sides, seeking reassurance he wasn't sure he could provide. What are we going to do? Emma asked Thomas thought about the story they had built together, about the official version of their family that existed only in their hearts and daily lives, but nowhere in legal documents. Then he thought about something else, a memory that had been nagging at him since Sarah first mentioned the children's mother. Emma, he said carefully, what was your mother's full name? Sarah Elizabeth Hartley, Emma said immediately. Why? Thomas felt his breath catch. Hartley. He knew that name. Had known a Hartley years ago when he was stationed at Fort Lewis. A young medic named Sarah who had talked about becoming a nurse, who had dreams of helping people, who had mentioned having family in Portland. Did your mother ever mention knowing any soldiers? Thomas asked. Anyone from the army? Emma looked puzzled. She dated a guy named Mike who was in the military, but that was when I was really little. She said she knew some other army people too, but I don't remember names. Thomas's heart began to race as the pieces of a plan formed. In his mind, it was dangerous, requiring him to bend the truth in ways that could backfire spectacularly. But if he was right about who Sarah Hartley had been, if his memory was accurate about the conversations they'd had years ago, he might be able to create the documentation Sarah Chun needed, not lies, exactly, but a version of the truth that emphasized different connections and relationships. I need to make some phone calls, Thomas said. And I need to tell you both something important about how your mother and I knew each other. As he looked into the children's trusting faces, Thomas realized he was about to gamble everything on a story that was partly true, partly hopeful fiction, and entirely necessary if they were going to remain together as a family. Thomas spent the night poring over documents he hadn't looked at in years, military records, deployment orders, photographs from his time at Fort Lewis. Somewhere in the collection of papers that had followed him through homelessness, job loss, and countless moves, he found what he was looking for, a group photo from a medical training exercise in 2018. There, in the second row, was a young woman in Army fatigues with the name Hartley stenciled on her uniform. Corporal Sarah Hartley, who had been assigned to their unit for 3 weeks during a joint training operation. Thomas remembered her clearly, now intelligent, determined, passionate about becoming a nurse practitioner after her service ended. He also remembered the conversations they'd had during downtime, the way she talked about her dreams of starting a family, her fears about the dangers of military life, her determination to create stability for any children she might have. Most importantly, He remembered her mentioning that she had family in Portland and that she planned to settle there after discharge. The photograph wasn't proof of a deep relationship, but it was evidence of a connection. Combined with the right paperwork and the right story, it might be enough to convince a family court that Sarah Hartley had known Thomas Murphy well enough to trust him with her children's future. While Emma and Lucas slept, Thomas began drafting a letter that would either save their family or destroy it completely. "Dear Sarah," he wrote, dating it 6 months before her death and addressing it to himself. "I know it's been years since we served together, but I've never forgotten the conversations we had about family and protecting the people we love. I'm writing because I need you to know that if anything ever happens to me, I want my children to be cared for by someone who understands what it means to keep families together." The letter went on to describe Emma and Lucas in terms that showed intimate knowledge of their personalities, their needs, their histories. It spoke of Sarah's trust in Thomas's character, his military service, his understanding of loyalty and commitment. Most crucially, it expressed her wish that he serve as guardian for her children if she was no longer able to care for them. Thomas aged the paper using tea stains and careful handling, made it look like something that had been carried in a wallet for months. It wasn't a legal document, but it was evidence of intent, proof that Sarah Hartley had known and trusted Thomas Murphy, enough to name him as her children's preferred guardian. The real challenge was creating supporting documentation that would pass scrutiny. Thomas called in favors from his military days, reaching out to former colleagues who could verify his service record and character. He contacted Father Martinez, who agreed to provide a letter attesting to Thomas's commitment to the children and his stability as a guardian. But the most important call was to someone Thomas hadn't spoken to in 3 years, his sister Rebecca, who lived in Seattle and had cut off contact with him after his descent into homelessness. "Thomas?" Rebecca's voice was cautious, surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Becca, I need your help," Thomas said. "And I need you to listen to the whole story before you decide whether you can give it." Over the next hour, Thomas told her everything about Emma and Lucas, about their life together, about the threat of separation they now faced. He explained what he needed from her: verification that he had spoken to her about the children, confirmation that he had been planning to gain legal custody, support for his petition to the family court. "Tommy," Rebecca said when he finished, using his childhood nickname for the first time in years, "are you telling me you've been caring for 2 orphan children for months without telling anyone in the family?" "I'm telling you I found my purpose." "Again," Thomas said. "These kids saved my life, Becca, and now I need to save theirs." There was a long silence before Rebecca spoke again. "What exactly do you need me to do?" By morning, Thomas had assembled a portfolio of documents that told a carefully constructed story. Former military colleagues who remembered Corporal Sarah Hartley fondly and could attest to her friendship with Sergeant Thomas Murphy. Family members who could verify that Thomas had mentioned the children and his intention to seek custody. Community leaders who could speak to his character and stability. The centerpiece was Sarah's letter, which Thomas had crafted to sound authentic, without being overly detailed, expressing clear intent without making claims that could be easily disproven. Emma found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, when she woke up for school. "Did you find a way to keep us together?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "I think so," Thomas said. "But Emma, I need you to understand something. Sometimes when people love each other, they have to fight for the right to stay together. That's what I'm doing, fighting for our family." Emma studied the papers scattered across the table, her mature eyes taking in the official letterheads and formal language. "Are you lying to them?" she asked. Thought the question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Emma deserved honesty, even if the truth was complicated. "I'm telling them a story that emphasizes the parts of your mother's life and my life that connect us," Thomas said carefully. Your mother did know me from the army. She did trust me. And if she could see how much I love you and Lucas, I believe she would want me to be your guardian." Emma nodded slowly. "So you're not lying about loving us?" "Never," Thomas said firmly. "That's the most true thing in any of these papers." Lucas appeared in the doorway, still clutching his teddy bear, his hair sticking up from sleep. "Are we still going to be a family?" he asked, the question that mattered most to him. Thomas pulled both children close, feeling the weight of their trust, the magnitude of what he was attempting to do. "We are a family," he said, "and I'm going to prove that to everyone who needs to know." As the children got ready for school, Thomas prepared for what might be the most important day of his life. In a few hours, Sarah Chen would return for his answer. He would hand her the carefully assembled documentation and wait to see if love and determination could overcome bureaucracy and legal technicalities. Walking Emma and Lucas to school that morning, Thomas tried to memorize every detail. The way Emma skipped ahead and then circled back to walk beside him. The way Lucas held his hand and chattered about his upcoming art project. The way both children trusted completely that he would find a way to protect what they had built together. At the school entrance, Emma hugged him fiercely. "Thank you for fighting for us," she whispered. Lucas wrapped his arms around Thomas's waist and looked up at him with complete faith. "See you after school, Dad," he said, using the word unconsciously, naturally, as if it had always been true. Walking away from the school, Thomas felt the full weight of his responsibility. These children had already lost too much. Their mother, their stability, their childhood innocence. They had found safety and love in an unconventional family, and Thomas would do whatever it took to ensure they didn't lose that too. The documentation in his folder might not satisfy every legal requirement, but it told the truth about what mattered most, that Sarah Hartley's children were loved, protected, and thriving under the care of someone who would never abandon them. Thomas spent the morning at work, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind rehearsed the conversation he would have with Sarah Chen. Martinez noticed his distraction and pulled him aside during lunch break. "You okay, Murphy? You seem like your mind's somewhere else today." Thomas found himself telling his foreman about the situation, about the children he'd been caring for, and the threat they now faced. To his surprise, Martinez listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as Thomas explained the complexities of their family. "You got character references in that folder of yours?" Martinez asked when Thomas finished. "A few," Thomas said. "Add one more," Martinez said, pulling out a business card. "I'll write you a letter tonight. Been watching you work for months now, and you're solid. Reliable. The kind of man who shows up every day and does what needs doing. If that's not father material, I don't know what is." The unexpected support nearly overwhelmed Thomas. For years, he had believed that his homelessness, his struggles, his failures had permanently disqualified him from being worthy of respect or trust. But Martinez saw him differently, saw the man he had become through loving Emma and Lucas, the person he was when he had something worth fighting for. At 2:30, Thomas left work early and arrived at the school as children poured out of the building. Emma spotted him immediately and ran over, followed closely by Lucas. "How did it go today?" Thomas asked as they walked home. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I can enter the district writing contest," Emma said proudly. "I'm going to write about families that choose each other instead of being born together." Lucas bounced beside them, excited to share his own news. "I made a new friend named Daniel, and he invited me to his birthday party next weekend. Can I go?" The normalcy of their concerns, homework and birthday parties and writing contests, struck Thomas powerfully. This was what childhood should look like, what these children deserved to experience without the constant threat of disruption hanging over their heads. "Of course you can go to the party," Thomas said, making a mental note to figure out how to buy an appropriate gift on their tight budget dot when they reached the apartment. Sarah Chun was already waiting in the hallway, her clipboard and professional demeanor intact, but her expression softer than it had been 2 days earlier. "Mr. Murphy," she said, "I hope you've had time to gather the documentation we discussed." "I have," Thomas said, unlocking the apartment door. "Would you like to come in and review it?" As Sarah settled at their small kitchen table, Thomas handed her the folder he had assembled. Emma and Lucas hovered nearby, their anxiety palpable. Despite Thomas's attempts to reassure them, Sarah opened the folder and began reading, her expression neutral as she examined each document. The military service records, the character references, the letter from Father Martinez. When she reached Sarah Hartley's letter, she studied it carefully, reading it twice before looking up at Thomas. "This letter from the children's mother," she said. "It's dated 6 months before her death." "Yes," Thomas said, his heart pounding. "She gave it to me when she learned about her illness, when she realized she might not be able to care for the children much longer." "And you've had it all this time?" "I carried it with me," Thomas said. "I hoped I'd never need to use it, but Sarah wanted me to have proof of her wishes if anything happened to her." Sarah Chun set down the letter and looked at Emma and Lucas, who were watching the conversation with the intensity of children whose entire future hung in the balance. "Lucas," she said gently, "could you give Mr. Murphy and me a few minutes to talk privately?" The children reluctantly retreated to Lucas's bedroom, though Thomas suspected they would try to listen from the hallway. "Mr. Murphy," Sarah said when they were alone, "these documents are impressive. The character references are strong. Your employment verification shows stability, and this letter from their mother certainly indicates her trust in you." Thomas waited, hardly breathing. "However," Sarah continued, "there are still legal procedures that must be followed. Even with these documents, you would need to file for formal guardianship through the family court system." "I understand that," Thomas said. "I'm prepared to do whatever is legally required. The process typically takes 6 to 8 months. During that time, the children would normally be placed in temporary foster care." Thomas felt his heart sink, but Sarah held up a hand. "However, given the strength of these documents and the clear evidence that the children are thriving in your care, I'm prepared to recommend emergency temporary guardianship while the formal process moves forward." Thomas stared at her, hardly believing what he was hearing. "What does that mean?" "It means the children can stay with you while we work through the legal requirements. You'll need to appear in family court within 30 days to file the formal petition, and there will be home visits and evaluations throughout the process. But Emma and Lucas won't be separated from you or from each other." The relief was so overwhelming that Thomas had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "There are conditions," Sarah continued. "You'll need to maintain stable housing and employment, ensure the children continue their education and medical care, and comply with all court requirements. Any significant changes in your circumstances must be reported immediately." "I understand," Thomas said. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing that we're a real family." Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd known her. "Mr. Murphy, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've learned that families come in all different forms. What matters isn't the paperwork. It's the love, stability, and commitment. It's clear that you've provided all 3 for Emma and Lucas." When she called the children back into the room to explain the decision, Lucas threw himself into Thomas's arms with such force that he nearly knocked over the chair. Emma hugged them both, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude that their unconventional family had been recognized and protected. As Sarah Chun packed up her papers and prepared to leave, she turned back to Thomas one final time. "You know, Mr. Murphy, I don't think I've ever seen children so clearly loved and cared for. Whatever brought you and Emma and Lucas together, you've created something beautiful here." After she left, The three of them sat together on the couch, still processing what had just happened. They were safe. They were legal. They were a family in the eyes of the law, as well as in their hearts. The family court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November. Thomas had taken the day off work, and the children's teachers had excused them from school so they could attend if needed. Walking up the courthouse steps, Thomas felt the weight of everything they had built together resting on the next few hours. Emma walked beside him in her best dress, a blue jumper that Father Martinez's housekeeper had altered to fit her perfectly. Lucas wore slacks and a button-down shirt that made him look impossibly grown-up. His teddy bear left at home for the first time in months at his own insistence. "I want to look responsible," he had explained seriously as they got ready that morning. Their lyre, provided by Catholic Charities, was a soft-spoken woman named Maria Santos who specialized in family law and had reviewed their case with careful attention to detail. "The documentation you provided creates a strong foundation," she had explained during their preparation meeting. "The judge will be looking at the children's current well-being, your ability to provide stable care, and evidence that this arrangement serves their best interests." Now, sitting in the courthouse hallway waiting for their case to be called, Thomas watched other families navigate their own legal challenges. Some looked confident, backed by expensive lawyers and thick folders of documentation. Others appeared overwhelmed, clutching warm papers and whispering anxiously among themselves. Murphy versus State of Oregon, regarding guardianship of Emma and Lucas Hartley. The bailiff called. Thomas stood, his legs steadier than he'd expected. Emma and Lucas flanked him as they entered the courtroom, their small hands finding his as they approached the judge's bench. Judge Catherine Williams was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the documents spread before her with the thoroughness of someone who understood that children's lives hung in the balance of every decision. "Mr. Murphy," she said, looking up from the papers, "I've read your petition for guardianship, and I've reviewed the supporting documentation. I'd like to hear in your own words why you believe granting this guardianship serves the best interests of Emma and Lucas." Thomas had practiced this moment, but standing before the judge with the children beside him, all his rehearsed words fell away. "Your Honor," he began, "6 months ago I was a man who had given up on himself and on the possibility of having anything meaningful in my life. When Emma and Lucas came to me that night, scared and alone after losing their mother, I could have turned them away. I could have told myself that I had nothing to offer them." He paused, looking down at the children who were watching him with complete trust. But they saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. They needed someone to believe in their future, to fight for their right to stay together, to show them that family isn't about blood or paperwork. It's about commitment and love and choosing each other every single day. Judge Williams nodded, making notes. "And what can you offer them now that you couldn't offer 6 months ago?" "Stability," Thomas said immediately. "A home, steady income, educational support. But more than that, I can offer them the promise that they'll never be abandoned again, that their family will remain intact, that they'll always have someone who puts their needs first. Mr. Murphy, I see here that you've had periods of unemployment and homelessness. How do I know that won't happen again?" Thomas had expected this question. "Your Honor, losing everything taught me what really matters. These children have given me a reason to be better than I was, stronger than I thought possible. I'm not the same man who lost his way 3 years ago. I'm the man Emma and Lucas helped me become." Judge Williams turned her attention to the children. "Emma, Lucas, I'd like to hear from you. How do you feel about Mr. Murphy being your guardian?" Emma stepped forward slightly, her voice clear and confident. "Your Honor, Thomas isn't just taking care of us. He's our father in every way that matters. He makes sure we do our homework. He reads to us at night. He comes to our school events. When Lucas had nightmares, Thomas would sit with him until he felt safe again. Lucas nodded earnestly. He taught me how to ride a bike and how to tie my shoes. He says I'm brave, and when he says it, I believe it. Do you want to stay with Mr. Murphy? The judge asked. Yes, both children said simultaneously, their voices strong and certain. Judge Williams consulted her notes again, then looked at the social worker's report. Miss Chun, you've conducted home visits and interviewed the family. What's your assessment? Sarah Chun stood, her professional demeanor softened by obvious affection for the family she'd been monitoring. Your Honor, in my 15 years of social work, I've rarely seen children who are so clearly thriving. Emma and Lucas have made remarkable progress academically and emotionally since coming into Mr. Murphy's care. Their home is modest but stable, clean, and filled with love. Mr. Murphy has demonstrated consistent commitment to their well-being and has utilized every resource available to provide for their needs. Any concerns about the arrangement? None, Your Honor. This is a family in the truest sense of the word. Judge Williams looked through the character references letters from teachers praising the children's progress, from Father Martinez attesting, to Thomas's commitment, from co-workers vouching for his reliability and character. Mr. Murphy, she said finally, guardianship is a serious responsibility. You would be legally responsible for these children's welfare, education, medical care, and emotional development until they reach adulthood. Do you understand the magnitude of that commitment? Yes, Your Honor, Thomas said, and I welcome it. These children have already made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. Being their father legally and officially would be the greatest honor of my life. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying the family before her. Thomas could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could feel Emma and Lucas holding their breath beside him. The court finds, Judge Williams said finally, that the evidence clearly demonstrates that granting guardianship to Thomas Murphy serves the best interests of Emma and Lucas Hartley. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their full meaning registered. Thomas felt his knees weaken with relief, while beside him, Emma gasped audibly, and Lucas grabbed his hand with both of his small ones. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, the court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that brought this family together and the remarkable progress all three individuals have made. Mr. Murphy, you have demonstrated that sometimes the most important qualifications for parenthood are love, commitment, and the willingness to put children's needs above your own. She signed the documents with a flourish that seemed to make their family official in ways that went beyond mere legality. Congratulations, she said, smiling warmly. You are now legally responsible for each other, which I suspect formalizes what has been true in your hearts for months. Outside the courtroom, Thomas knelt down and pulled Emma and Lucas into his arms, holding them close as the reality of what had just happened washed over him. We did it, Emma whispered, her voice thick with tears. We're really a family now. We were always a family, Thomas said. Now we have the papers to prove it. Lucas pulled back to look at Thomas's face, his expression serious. Does this mean you can never leave us? It means I never want to leave you, Thomas said. And it means that legally, officially, and in every way that matters, you're my children, and I'm your father. Maria Santos approached them with copies of the signed documents, her own eyes bright with emotion. These make it official, she said, handing Thomas the papers. You'll want to update the children's school records, insurance information, and any other documentation that requires guardian signatures. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Thomas marveled at how different this felt from their frightened ascent just hours earlier. Then, they had been a family fighting for recognition. Now, they were simply a family legal, protected, permanent. Can we celebrate? Emma asked. Maybe go out to dinner somewhere nice? Thomas thought about their budget, about the careful calculations that still governed their daily lives. Then he looked at his children's hopeful faces and realized that some moments were worth stretching financially. "Absolutely," he said. "Where would you like to go?" "Somewhere with dessert," Lucas said immediately. "Somewhere that has those little lights on the tables," Emma added, clearly envisioning the kind of restaurant she'd seen in movies but never experienced. Thomas knew exactly the place, a family restaurant downtown that wasn't expensive but had the kind of atmosphere that would make this celebration feel special. Over dinner, as Emma and Lucas excitedly discussed their new legal status with the enthusiasm of children who had finally found security, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a broken man with no future, surviving from day to day without hope or purpose. Tonight, he was a father celebrating the legal recognition of a family built on love and determination. "Thomas," Emma said, interrupting his thoughts, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever miss your old life? Before us, I mean?" The question was perceptive in the way that Emma's questions often were, cutting straight to the heart of things adults usually danced around. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I miss some things about the man I used to be," he said honestly. "I miss feeling confident about my place in the world, miss having plans that stretched further than the next meal or the next safe place to sleep." Emma nodded, understanding. More than most children, her age would about the weight of survival. "But," Thomas continued, "I don't miss being alone. I don't miss thinking that my life didn't matter to anyone. You and Lucas gave me back my purpose, showed me that I was capable of being someone worth depending on. So we saved each other," Lucas said, the observation delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Yes," Thomas said, "we absolutely saved each other." Later that evening, after they had returned home and the children had gone to bed, Thomas sat in the living room holding the guardianship papers. The official language was formal and legal, full of whereas clauses and legal terminology, but what it really said was simple. This was his family. These were his children, and no one could take that away from them. He thought about Sarah Hartley, about the young woman in uniform who had talked about her dreams of helping people and creating a stable life for her future family. He hoped that somehow, wherever she was, she knew that her children were safe and loved, that they were growing into remarkable young people who carried the best of her with them. Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing her pajamas and carrying her notebook. "I can't sleep," she said. "Too excited, I think. Want to sit with me for a few minutes?" Thomas offered. She settled beside him on the couch, opening her notebook to a fresh page. "I'm writing a letter to Mama," she explained. "I want to tell her about today, about how we're officially a family now." Thomas watched as she wrote, her young handwriting careful and clear. "Dear Mama, today the judge said that Thomas is our legal guardian, which means he's officially our dad now. I know you're probably watching over us, and I want you to know that we're happy and safe. Thomas loves us the way you did, and he fights for us the way you always fought for us. Lucas is doing so much better. He talks all the time now, and he's making friends at school. I'm doing well too. I'm writing stories about families like ours, families that choose each other and stick together no matter what." She paused in her writing and looked up at Thomas. "Should I tell her about you being homeless when we found you?" Thomas considered this. "What do you think?" "I think I should tell her the truth," Emma said. "That sometimes good people go through hard times, but that doesn't make them less good. And that sometimes the best families are the ones that have to fight to stay together." She returned to her letter. "Mama, I think you would like the man we chose to be our dad. He's brave and kind, and he never gives up on us. He reads to Lucas every night and helps me with my homework and makes sure we always feel safe. I know you wanted us to find someone who would take care of us, and we did. We found each other." When she finished writing, Emma closed the notebook and curled up against Thomas's side. Do you think she knows? Emma asked. About today, about how happy we are. Thomas thought about love that transcended death, about the way Sarah Hartley's children had found their way to him in their darkest moment, about the series of choices and chances that had brought them together. I think she knows, he said, and I think she's proud of how strong and brave you've both been. As Emma drifted off to sleep beside him, Thomas looked around their small apartment, at Lucas's artwork on the refrigerator, at Emma's books stacked neatly on the table, at the family photos they had begun to collect, documenting their life together. It wasn't the home he had once imagined for himself, but it was perfect in its imperfection, complete in its unconventional structure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, homework help, and doctor appointments, parent-teacher conferences, and birthday parties, all the ordinary responsibilities of family life. But tonight, Thomas simply sat with his sleeping daughter in his arms and marveled at the miracle of second chances, at the power of love to rebuild broken lives and create families from the most unlikely circumstances. 2 years later, Thomas stood in the kitchen of their new house, a modest 3-bedroom home with a small yard where Lucas could play and a quiet study space where Emma could write, watching his children get ready for their last day of school before summer vacation. The house had been a stretch financially, requiring him to take on additional weekend work and carefully budget every expense. But seeing Emma and Lucas race through rooms that truly belonged to them made every sacrifice worthwhile. Lucas had his own room decorated with his artwork and soccer trophies from the youth league Thomas coached. Emma had transformed her room into a writer's retreat, complete with a desk positioned by the window where she could watch the seasons change as she worked on her stories. Dad, Lucas called from the living room, using the title that had become as natural as breathing. Can Daniel sleep over tonight to celebrate the start of summer? As long as it's okay with his parents, Thomas replied, smiling at the easy way Lucas navigated friendships now. His early trauma healed by years of consistent love and security. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over her shoulder, her notebook now the 5th in a series tucked carefully inside. Mrs. Rodriguez wants to submit my story about found families to a state writing contest, she announced. She thinks I have a real chance of winning. Thomas felt the familiar surge of pride that had become a constant companion since becoming a father. That's wonderful. What's the story about? It's about a girl who learns that the strongest families are the ones that choose each other, Emma said. It's fiction, but it's based on true events. The phrase made Thomas laugh, remembering the careful line they had walked between truth and necessity in those early legal proceedings. The guardianship had become permanent 6 months after that first court hearing, and Thomas had eventually shared with Emma and Lucas the creative liberties he had taken with their family history. Rather than being upset, the children had been impressed by his resourcefulness and determination to keep them together. Sometimes, Emma had said after learning the full story, the most important truths aren't the ones in official documents. Now, as they prepared to leave for school, Thomas reflected on how completely their lives had transformed. He had been promoted to site supervisor at the construction company, a position that came with better pay and health insurance that covered all 3 of them. Emma was excelling academically and had begun tutoring younger students in reading and writing. Lucas had not only overcome his early selective mutism, but had become one of the more outgoing children in his class, quick to befriend new students and include anyone who seemed left out. Their unconventional beginning had become a source of strength rather than shame. Emma often wrote about resilience and found families in her school assignments. Lucas had participated in a class presentation about different types of families, proudly explaining how some fathers and children find each other instead of being born together. Ready? Thomas asked, grabbing his keys and the lunch he had packed for his day at the job site. They walked to school together, as they had every morning for over 2 years, a routine that had evolved from necessity into tradition. Other parents nodded and waved, recognizing them as the Murphy family, the single dad who never missed a school event, and his two remarkable children who had clearly landed in exactly the right place. At the school entrance, Emma hugged Thomas goodbye, but Lucas lingered for a moment. "Dad," he said, his 8-year-old voice serious, "are you happy?" The question surprised Thomas. "What makes you ask that?" "Yesterday, I heard Mrs. Peterson telling Mrs. Chung that some parents sacrifice so much for their kids that they forget to be happy," Lucas explained. "I wanted to make sure you remember to be happy too." Thomas knelt down to Lucas's level, struck by the child's intuitive understanding of the balance between sacrifice and joy that defined parenthood. "Lucas," he said, "taking care of you and Emma isn't a sacrifice. It's the thing that makes me happiest in the world. Every morning when I wake up and know that I get to be your dad for another day, I feel like the luckiest person alive." Lucas nodded, satisfied with this answer, and ran off to join his friends on the playground. Walking to work, Thomas thought about Lucas's question and realized how completely his definition of happiness had changed. 2 years ago, happiness had seemed like an impossible luxury, something for people whose lives hadn't fallen apart. Now, happiness was as simple as Emma reading him a story she'd written or Lucas learning to catch a baseball. It was parent-teacher conferences where he heard about his children's progress and kindness toward their classmates. It was Saturday morning pancakes and bedtime stories, and the 1,000 small moments that comprised a family life built on love and intentional choices. That evening, after Daniel's parents had dropped him off for the sleepover, and the boys were settled in Lucas's room with movies and more snacks than they could possibly consume, Thomas found Emma on the back porch, writing in her notebook by the fading light. "What are you working on?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "A letter to Mama," Emma said. "I still write to her sometimes, especially when something important happens." "What are you telling her about?" Emma looked up from her notebook, her 12-year-old face showing the maturity that had always marked her character, but also the contentment that had come with years of security. "I'm telling her about Lucas's soccer team making it to the finals, and about my story that might win the state contest, and about how you're teaching me to drive even though I won't be old enough for a license for 4 more years," Emma said. "But mostly I'm telling her that we're okay. That we're more than okay. We're happy." She paused, looking out at the small yard where Thomas had helped her plant a garden and where Lucas practiced his soccer skills every afternoon. "I'm telling her that you kept your promise," Emma continued. "That we stayed together, that we became a real family, that she doesn't have to worry about us anymore." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he thought about Sarah Hartley and the trust she had placed, knowingly or unknowingly, in his ability to care for her children. "Do you miss her less now?" he asked gently. Emma considered this. "I don't miss her less, but it hurts less. Like, I still wish she could be here to see us at Christmas morning, or when I win the writing contest, or when Lucas scores a goal. But I'm not scared anymore that we'll forget her, or that loving you means we love her less. You could never love her less," Thomas said. "She's part of who you are, part of what makes you the amazing person you've become." "I know," Emma said. "I think she's part of our family still, even though she's not here. Like, the love she gave us helped us recognize love when we found it again." That night, after the boys had finally settled down to sleep and Emma had finished her letter, Thomas sat in the living room of their house, their home surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. School photos and report cards, Lucas's soccer trophies and Emma's writing awards, family pictures from birthday parties and holidays and ordinary Sundays that had become precious simply because they had been shared. On the mantel sat a framed photo of Sarah Hartley that Emma had found among her mother's things, and that now occupied a place of honor in their home. In it, Sarah was laughing, her arms around a younger Emma and Lucas, all three of them radiating the joy of a family moment captured in time. Thomas looked at that photo every day, a reminder of the woman whose death had led to his resurrection, whose children had saved him from the slow suicide of hopelessness and given him a reason to become the man he was meant to be. In his wallet, he still carried the business card Sarah Chun had given him that first day under the bridge, though. It was worn now and faded, not as a reminder of the threat it had once represented, but as evidence of how far they had all come, how love and determination could overcome systems and circumstances that seemed insurmountable. Outside, the summer evening was settling into the kind of peace that came with security, with knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same blessed ordinary moments that comprised a happy family life. Inside, three people who had found each other in their darkest hours slept safely under the same roof, protected by laws and documents, but more importantly by the bonds they had chosen to forge and strengthen every day. Thomas Murphy had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest challenges, that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding what really matters. He had learned that family isn't about blood or circumstance, but about showing up, day after day, and choosing love over fear, commitment over convenience, hope over despair. In the morning, he would wake up and make breakfast for his children, drive Lucas to soccer practice and Emma to the library, continue the ordinary work of raising two remarkable young people who had taught him that the purpose of life wasn't to avoid pain but to find meaning in it, to transform suffering into service, loss into love. Tonight, though, he simply sat in gratitude for the unexpected mercy that had brought Emma and Lucas to his cardboard shelter on that cold October night, for the chance to rebuild not just his own life, but to help them build theirs, for the daily miracle of being trusted with their futures and their hearts. Sometimes, the greatest acts of love come from those who have the least to give. Sometimes a broken man becomes whole again only when he finds someone who needs him more than he needs healing. Sometimes three strangers become a family simply by refusing to give up on each other, by believing that love is always enough if it's accompanied by the courage to fight for it. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they get to live happily ever after, not because their story was perfect, but because it was true.